What's up, alumni? Welcome to After 4, your podcast for navigating life after graduation. I'm your host and guide, John Steele. We're continuing our wellness series this week with one more expert interview, and we're touching on a topic that I have a feeling most of us don't consider very often when we think about wellness. And that topic is thinking, intellectual wellness. How do we take care of our mind and our intellect as we make this transition to life after graduation? And why should we in the first place? Our guest today, Stan Wallace, the president and CEO of Global Scholars, has a lot of phenomenal insight on the topic, and he's going to help us take positive steps toward intellectual health and thinking Christianly. Not only that, he's going to help us understand how this isn't just good for us, but good for our interactions with God and with the people we encounter on a daily basis. All right, here's Stan, and this one's for you, alumni. Stan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here.
So excited to have you. Stan, before we jump into our topic of conversation today, would you just do me and our listeners the honor of giving us a little introduction, helping us get to know you?
Sure. I serve as president and CEO of Global Scholars. We equip Christian professors in public universities around the world to be salt and light on campus among their students and colleagues and academic disciplines. I'm married now in about a week, coming up on my 40th anniversary.
Wow.
So
that's
big
awesome.
Milestone for us.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. 4 children, 2 older daughters, 2 younger sons. Youngest son's just finished college. So
Wow.
they're right where a lot of your listeners are, I think, starting into the workaday world. So I understand that firsthand now as a father. And live in Kansas City, Kansas. I've been here since I joined Global Scholars. Was with InterVarsity before this.
Okay.
Spent a decade or so with InterVarsity graduate and faculty ministries, directing the faculty ministry during those years mostly, and working with the Emerging Scholars Network and some other things. So I've got some IV roots, but yeah.
Love it. It's always fun to get to talk to somebody that knows the landscape of the university, that understands our alumni and the things we've done on campus with them, and to know that you have some just real life down home experience with people going through this post-graduation transition, living life after college, after graduation. So I'm excited to have somebody with all of these different, you're a stakeholder in many different ways. And that makes me really excited for our conversation today. Stan, just to give you a little bit of a runway here into our conversation, we've started off 2025 looking at health and wellness. It's a new year, very common time to be thinking about, all right, what are my patterns of health or unhealth that I'd like to be thinking about? And we've talked about a number of different things up to this point. We've had we had a health and wellness coach come in and talk about what does it look like to develop an overall plan for wellness so that people could start thinking about that. We talked about mental health. We've talked about exercise and nutrition. Today, I'm hoping to lean into a topic that I'm not sure that everybody considers when they think about health and wellness. And that's intellectual health, or another phrase that maybe in the world of InterVarsity, and probably even beyond, that people have heard, I imagine, is like discipleship of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
But I know that you also have a term that you've sort of coined in this same area that's thinking Christianly. So as we think about intellectual health, I'm wondering if you could sort of help us dig into that. Like, what does it mean to think Christianly, and where do you see that fitting into our sort of overall holistic health?
Okay, great. By the way, for the record, I did not coin the term.
Oh, you didn't coin the phrase.
It goes back to a watershed book, actually, I think in the 50s by Henry Blameyer of that title. And that's when it sort of became a way to talk about these issues. But I certainly use it a lot.
Yes. All right. There we go.
Your point. So let's just start with the words of Jesus. Where else better to start, right? He describes our flourishing as loving the Lord our God with our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And often we are really good at loving God with the heart, but not as much loving God with the mind. but he put those in equal footing, as well as what we do, our strength, and everything else. So what do we see through Scripture beyond that? We see all over the place this same theme come up. Paul comments that we need to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, and that's how we will prove the will of God, that which is good and acceptable and perfect, right? Psalm 26:2, David invites the Lord to test me, Lord, and try me and examine my heart and my mind.
Wow.
So the two go together, and we can always, like in most, maybe all areas, lean one way or the other. Too much mind, not enough heart.
Yes.
Too much heart, not enough mind.
Right.
It's a both and that's where flourishing is. That's where really experiencing all God has for us is.
How do you see that impacting, the conversations that we've had up to this point about wellness is that so often different elements of wellness kind of bump into one another.
Right.
So where do you see leaning into the sort of this discipleship of the mind, offering up the way that we think to the Lord and developing in that way? How do you see that kind of bumping into other elements of wellness?
I love that question. I just came out with a book this summer, and one chapter actually engages that in some detail.
Okay.
The book is Have We Lost Our Minds? Neuroscience, Neurotheology, the Soul, and Human Flourishing. And the middle section of the book talks about what is the soul and how does it relate to the body, and how does all that relate to human flourishing. So this is exactly what I'm addressing. So in summary, think of a Ferris wheel, a very small Ferris wheel. There's 6 cars in this Ferris wheel, and there's 6 different groups of friends lined up to get in each car. And, first group gets in one car and they start talking, having a good time. It rolls around. The next group gets in the next car and they're all talking, having a good time, and it's eventually filled up. But it's a small enough Ferris wheel that the people in one car start talking to the people in the other cars and having a good time all together. And in fact, they decide in one car, we're going to go ride the roller coaster after this. And they talk to the other car, and the other car says, yeah, we'll go with you. So they kind of influence one another, right?
Okay.
That's a picture of the soul and its interrelationships. So each of those cars in our soul is called a faculty. So we have a mental faculty, and that has different capacities in it. These are the people in the car, right? The mental faculty has beliefs and desires and thoughts, so on and so forth. And those all affect one another. What we desire affects what we believe and what we think about, right? There's connections there.
Okay.
But another of those faculties, those cars, if you will, is the emotional faculty. And in that faculty are different capacities, different quote unquote people, right? Capacities like the capacity to experience joy or despair or what have you, right? And the mental faculty affects that faculty, right? So if I have wrong beliefs, I may experience depression because I have wrong beliefs about myself or about the world or about my family or whatever it is, and vice versa. If I experience God's presence emotionally in certain ways, that can help me. That can help my belief. Like I've had some experiences of God's direct presence. It's a very emotional experience, but it's helped me in my belief. It's helped me in my mental faculty to be able to lean in more to what I know is true, but it gives me more of the confirmation that it's true.
Please.
So in each of these faculties, there's a natural telos. Now that's a Greek word that just means end or kind of goal. So we naturally move in these different areas toward maturity. So let's talk about the emotional faculty.
Yeah.
We naturally grow emotionally, and the things that were okay, kind of expected when we're 2, aren't so good when we're 10 or 20. So for instance,
right.
Your child's at Target and wants a toy. You say no, he's on the floor throwing a temper tantrum. Well, what do we say? That's terrible twos. Okay. I mean, it's not good, but it's to be
Right.
expected. It just kind of happens,
Yes.
right, at 2. Now, if you've got your 10-year-old in the store and the same thing happens, or your 20-year-old, okay,
Right.
we got a problem, right?
Yes.
Because there's a natural maturity process that at 2 certain things are expected that aren't expected at 10 or 20. And this is where professionals come in. So your listeners are in different areas now.
Yeah.
If somebody isn't maturing as they ought to mature, okay, now notice that normative language. There's a normal, natural progression. And if someone isn't maturing as they ought to, and by the time they're 10, they're still having temper tantrums, specialists exist to help intervene. They realize where a child should be by 10 and he or she is not. So they're able to help them overcome the deficiency so they can get to where they need to be at 10. My wife is an educator. She's a 4th grade teacher. Children by 4th grade should be able to do certain things. And she has expertise to say, okay, this child's behind in reading or math, and I need to intervene to help him or her get up to speed. This is what counselors do when there are deficiencies in healthy relationships. People aren't able to engage one another in healthy ways, for instance. They know how to intervene and help that person get to where they ought to be at this stage of development to be functioning well and flourishing. And by the way, the full telos, the full end, is Christ. As he, as a fully human person, fully exemplified what maturity looks like in each of these capacities and faculties of soul.
Yeah. What are some of the ways that we lean into maturing in the way that we think in our, this intellectual discipleship of the mind? Like, how do we pursue maturity?
The mental faculty traffics in ideas, right? That's what the mind does in terms of if the mind is defined as the mental set of capacities in that faculty, the way I'm using it. And so we flourish, we grow, we mature, we think Christianly as we believe more and more true propositions, and we don't believe more and more false propositions or claims about reality. Okay. Now, how do we do that? Well, the good news is God has revealed truth. He's revealed what is the case through his 2 books of Revelation, the scriptures and what's called general revelation, the world around us that we can study through all the other areas. And so we should be trying to learn what's true and live accordingly through those 2 books of Revelation for studying the scriptures and studying the world around us. And that could come in very different fields. And not all of us are going to study physics. I don't, but we have certain areas that we are interested in. We can study, and we can read in other areas that we're not experts in, but at least might help us learn some things. So let me suggest a book that I think is the best book on this. It's a book written by my mentor. I took my master's and doctorate at Talbot under J.P. Moreland, a Christian philosopher and theologian.
Okay.
And a number of years ago, he wrote a very good book. It's titled Love the Lord Your God with All Your Mind. And the subtitle is The Role of Reason in the Life of the Soul. And his point is just this, that we need to love God with our minds, which I'm using in this case synonymously with soul. But how do we do it? And chapter by chapter, he walks through exactly how to do it. And there are a lot of very practical aspects to it, which include the community we're in and how we're spurred on to love and good deeds, even in this area by those we're around, so on and so forth. So I would really suggest that's a place that readers or listeners could go to kind of think more about this. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's trying to take everything we know and bring it into a whole cloth understanding of the world, and keep refining it by what we're reading, by who we're around, what we're listening to, learning to, and this is a whole chapter in that book, learning to discern the argument. Now, I'm using that word technically, right? The premises that are leading to somebody's conclusion, whether it's a newscaster or a blogger or a podcaster or a friend you're having coffee with, everyone is making arguments all the time when they make a claim of what's true. Now, it's very rarely put into a formal structure where there's premise one, premise two, conclusion. So, but it's there. And just learning to say, okay, this person is assuming this and this to get there. Is that right? Is that assumption true? So that's what I'm doing in my book, for instance. I'm trying to integrate what do we know from neuroscience and from theology and from philosophy about what we are. And I'm noticing some neurotheologians, and the two that I critique are Jim Wilder and Kurt Thompson, who are very popular, great guys, doing great work, helpful pastoral work, but they're making some assumptions about what we are that are just wrong. They're saying, well, we've got correlations between mental events like beliefs and brain events. Therefore, those things must be the same. And ultimately, the brain must be the driver here. And that's a wrong assumption. So it's identifying the assumptions that lead to conclusions and then being able to evaluate those assumptions in light of everything we know. So that's what I do in the book. I evaluate that assumption in light of what we also know from scripture and from philosophy about our nature.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Stan, as you're talking, I'm reminded of this one piece of scripture from Hebrews chapter 5 that talks about milk and solid food.
Yeah.
And I pulled it up here that anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with the teaching about righteousness, but solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish good from evil. And that feels like in the same vein of what you're talking about, of like you are spending time leaning into what is true. And when you are discerning, as you continue to discern truth from falsehood, it almost seems like those are the places that God gives us, that like grants us some sort of deeper access or deeper understanding of who he is and the things that he's done. And that so much of it is about this sort of disciplined approach, getting lots of reps in with the materials that he has provided for us to learn more and more about who he is, how he's created the world, how he's made us, and so what that means, what is in fact true, and that just like grants us this new level of connection in some way.
It absolutely does, and in the last two chapters in this book, actually, I apply that then to, okay, so what are the implications of that for loving God, spiritual formation, and loving others?
Let's go there.
Ministry and engaging our culture in issues that are important, and then also in our professional lives.
Okay.
Because all ideas have implications. All ideas, then again, because of the connections within our soul, the things we come to believe are true are going to affect how we live, the choices we make, the relationships we have or don't have, the emotional health we have, et cetera, et cetera. So there's huge practical implications to all this.
Yeah, but that and once again, Stan, I'm confused about who the host of this conversation is right here, because you're just like taking me exactly where I want to go, Stan. Because that is the next thing that I want to know about is what are some of those practical implications, not just the how-to, but the so then what happens when we do lean into this thinking Christianly, taking care of this inner, taking care of our mind, taking care of our soul. Like, what are the implications for the way that we interact with God and the way that we interact with the world around us?
Yes, and that's the kind of the distinction. So let's talk about the first, how we interact with God.
Yes.
Interesting story I'll tell. Most of your listeners will probably be familiar with Dallas Willard, wrote a lot in spiritual formation. And as he was nearing the end of his life here on earth, he called his protege, J.P. Moreland, out to his house for a last chat. This is a couple months before he passed away, actually. And J.P. tells the story in his eulogy of Dallas at Dallas's memorial service. It's online, so listeners can find that and watch it. But he said Dallas wanted to tell me two things. There are two things he was worried about as he passed the baton, so to speak. that he really wanted to continue to see developed. And the first was he was really worried that the spiritual formation movement, which he had a very significant role in helping to bolster at least, that the spiritual formation movement would not develop much theological or philosophical sophistication. In other words, it would be very superficial, and therefore it would kind of go off the rails, which again is what I'm trying to address in my book. One way I think it's going off the rails.
Yeah.
And that's just to say that, we only love God if we understand well who he is, who we are, and how we relate to him. And those are all truths that we could have wrong and believe falsehoods. And so the whole area of spiritual formation is central is essentially related to how we think, how we love God with our minds. Now, the distinction I need to make, it's a little bit of a technical distinction, but it has huge cash value in both this and the other area of loving others, is, okay, so we are a soul and body. We're not just physical things. The first part of my book, arguing that we're more than physical. We're essentially a soul that has a body. But then there are two different ideas out there. Again, here we're back to beliefs about what's true. There are two views about what we are then, and essentially what the connection is between the soul and the body. And one is the very popular view, and we hear it in churches all the time. We hear it in sure that all the listeners have heard this at some point in InterVarsity. I've heard it again. It's just part of the air we breathe in the Western evangelical post-Reformation church today.
Okay.
And it's this idea that, well, really the important stuff is spiritual. Like the stuff that you do in your body is it's not that important, or it may be harmful to your spiritual life. So Bible study, prayer, being involved in your local church, all those things, that's where the action is spiritually. That's where you really are growing and it is valuable to God. The other stuff, it's a necessary evil, going to work and raising children, whatever it is, right? Unless there's a spiritual implication. If I can go to work, and this is a battle that we always fought with in faculty ministry, is your work is valuable in and of itself. And it's part of what God's called you to do, regardless of if you get a chance to share the gospel every day with a student, right? It's like, hey, no, your work has intrinsic value, not just instrumental value.
Wow.
And that's contrary to this view. It's called Cartesian dualism, or a very radical dualism, where spirit and matter, soul and body, are so different, and all the actions in the soul. No. And this is a grounding of Dallas Willard's work in the spiritual disciplines. If we are this deep unity of soul and body, which is the view I advocate for in the book, it's called holistic dualism, that we are a duality. We're not one thing. We are a two. We are a soul that has a body, but we're so deeply united functionally that we work as one. So what we do in our body affects our soul. So everything becomes a spiritual discipline. Everything we do in the day-to-day life, in our body, is part of our discipleship unto Christ and helps shape us and form us in his image. So very practical implications there that we could talk a long time about, but that's kind of the thumbnail.
Sure.
Now, loving others. Ministry. There are at least 3 different areas that this has direct application to, this being what we believe about the nature of our soul and our body. So, if we take, and I'll just name them, the Cartesian view, the radical bifurcation of soul and body, and the holistic view, a deep integration. If we take the Cartesian view, then our work is it's mundane. The word mundane comes from the Latin mundi, which is worldly or earthly, and has the connotation of kind of irrelevant or worse to our spiritual life. So we'll see our work as unimportant unless we can make enough money to give to people who are doing really important stuff like missionaries and pastors, right? That's okay. But it's an instrumental view, like back to what I was talking about before. So, but if you've got this holistic understanding, then you see all of life as sacred or sacramental. And as a result, you see your work in a very different way. And so
when we lean into thinking Christianly, when we lean into this kind of intellectual wellness, that it doesn't just bump into the other parts of our own, like, oh, this is helpful for propping up this other part of my wellness. Like, because we are holistic beings, that does happen. Those things are integrated. They are important for one another, but it also changes the way that we interact and think about and look at other people. That when we think Christianly, we look at people more humanly.
right,
We look at them more holistically, not just as something utilitarian, not just as something that like sort of helps me check a box and complete a job that I need to get done, but as somebody who has a past, present, and future, and that there's stuff going on in this person's life that is interacting with their soul in really important ways. And so how does that impact the way that I choose to interact with them?
Right.
And those feel like huge implications. Stan, two last things that I'd like you to help us with here. One is for our audience, alumni who are in their first year of life after graduation, who are hearing this and saying like, okay, what's my next step for moving in the direction of thinking Christianly, of intellectual wellness? What's one piece of practical start today kind of advice that you would give? And then two, the follow up to that is tell us one more time about your book and where people can find it, so that if they want to take a deep dive into this, that they can start doing that. So practical next step, and tell us one more time about your book and where we can find it.
Okay,
that would be super helpful.
Appreciate it. I'm going to give you two next steps.
Okay, perfect. Love it. 2 feet, 2 steps.
So one is to find others who also want to love God with their minds, which assumes not everyone does. I think the majority of believers don't actually want to follow the greatest commandment to love God with their minds, but find those who do. One of the ways that I've always done it is either in churches, and I've moved around a lot, so a lot of different experiences, but churches I've been in whatever city we were living in for that season, I've found some group that wanted to read something with me, or not me leading it necessarily, but let's just read something together. Maybe I was in a Sunday school class where there were 4 or 5 other people who really asked good questions all the time. They were just really thoughtful. So I just go up to them and say, I really like questions you ask. They make me think about things I hadn't thought about. I'm wondering if you might want to have a reading group and read something together. Maybe they mentioned a book that they had read that was really good, or there's a topic that maybe there's a book on this we could read together, and you just, find something. There's so much out there, but just find a few other people. And it doesn't have to be a ton of people, 2 or 3 other people to meet at, a coffee shop once a week and just talk about a chapter or part of a chapter of a book that can just lead into all kinds of good conversations. And it could be in any area, right? It might be in theology, but it might not. I want to emphasize that. It could be in any other area, because it's all part of God's revelation if we're finding truth. It could be his second book of Revelation that we're leaning into as we study psychology and understand where that integrates with biblical truth, right? So to just find a community to, again, spur one another on to loving good deeds in this way. Second one, a shameful plug, I guess. JP Moreland and I do a monthly podcast called Thinking Christianly. And we do that for this reason, to engage in conversations about important issues that we as believers should be thinking about. And it's on I think it's all on all podcast platforms, should be easy to find, but it could be helpful. And it could then connect through the conversation and the show notes to all kinds of other things that might be helpful to read or podcasts to listen to or what have you. Okay?
Great.
And then you want me to plug my book? You don't have to twist my arm?
Please tell us. I'll so, whatever I have to do to get you to plug your book, I'll do it.
Here it is. Have We Lost Our Minds? Neuroscience, Neurotheology, the Soul, and Human Flourishing. And it's actually 3 books in one. So readers could pick it up and read parts and not all, and that's totally fine. The first is a critique of this growing movement within evangelical churches called neurotheology. and why we can't reduce the soul to the body, the mind to the brain. Second part is, okay, then what are we? What is the soul, and how does it relate to the body? And that's what I talked about earlier in terms of the Ferris wheel analogy and unpacking all that. And then the third section is, so what? How does it help us love God and love others, which we talked about as well. So
perfect. So you've given us some glimpses into things that you take a much deeper dive in this book. So this has been a nice maybe primer before people pick up your book.
And I footnote a lot to the earlier conversation about finding people and reading stuff together. I footnote a lot of other things that go even further. So somebody might read it and say, oh, wow, that's interesting. Oh, here's something else that looks like a really good thing to read. I want to read this with this group of folks.
That's awesome. Stan, thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun. This is a very different kind of conversation than what I oftentimes get to have. So this has just been really great to dig into sort of the story behind the story in some ways, like the philosophical underpinnings of how we think and why we should think this way, and why we were commanded to love God with our mind, and why that is so important. And I'm just really grateful for your time and for your investment in our alumni who are stepping out of a time of just serious intellectual engagement with their classes and their classmates and their chapters into a time that I think could feel really easy to like put critical thinking on the shelf and just knuckle down and do my work. Like that's what I got to do. I just got to work hard. And to say like, no, don't stop. You've got this momentum towards like investing in your mind. Keep making good, godly investments in your mind for the long term. And that this is such an important part of a holistic health approach. So thank you for helping us think really well about that.
Thanks. And I'll say to your listeners, if any listeners want to reach out to me, they can contact me through my website, stanwallace.org. And they might also find some other things there. I've got 100 and some articles on different issues there, and might be helpful. But if I could be helpful in any other ways, I'd love to engage some of your listeners.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Stan. I appreciate you a lot.
Mutual. Appreciate it.
Alumni, is this an area that comes to mind when you think about your wellness journey? Or has loving God with your mind gotten lost in the mix somewhere? Clearly, Stan would advocate that this is not only an important part of your wellness journey, but is also a central part of loving God and loving others well. I highly encourage you to go get a copy of Stan's book, Have We Lost Our Minds, or some other book that challenges you intellectually and encourages you to think the way that Jesus thinks. You can check the show notes for a few ideas. Stan, thank you so much for joining us today. I had a blast chatting with you, and I so appreciate your encouragement to lean into this aspect of our wellness. Alumni, come back next week as we talk about emotional wellness with Dr. Kevin Chapman, the author of Mastering Our Emotions, Biblical Principles for Emotional Health. Dr. Chapman is going to help us take next steps in our emotional transformation during this season of post-graduation transition. Until then, consider sharing this episode with someone who needs to hear it, and I will see you in the after, alumni. Thanks for listening to After 4. This podcast is brought to you by the InterVarsity Alumni Relations Team, hosted and produced by John Steele, production assistance by Mike Zentera, edited by Caleb Leppert, and our After 4 theme music was written and performed by John Steele.